Hi, and specialty DU. So we're gonna get started with the last section of milk, which is creating different recipes and my biggest tips in terms of steaming and training for milk drink composition. So number one, it's basically just like a signature beverage composition. You're looking at different ingredients, different compositions, and you're gonna basically be tasting and testing what is the best and most balanced, harmonious balance of espresso and milk in your beverage. So normally, obviously, you're gonna have your milk as your ingredient, and then obviously your espressos. But when we talk about milk, creating different compositions to test out. So for example, like I previously said, I'll have maybe a 70-30 composition of distillation and regular milk together as one recipe. And then maybe I'll have a 50-50 of freeze distilled and regular milk. And then I'm gonna be using these in order to create different compositions of milk beverage. And then when we talk about espresso, we always talk about how many grams of espresso. So normally in a double shot or in a single shot, we're gonna have 25 to 30 mLs of espresso. And then depending on the cups that we use, we wanna figure out how much milk we're gonna add into this and create this sort of balance. And then temperature as well will be the final factor that sort of sets into what kind of milk drink that we want to create. So we're gonna start with sort of these variables, and then I'm gonna give a little bit of tips about temperature depending from the different kinds of milk overall. Normally, the biggest tip that we give out is that the more animal fat and the higher fat content, it means that we can stretch the milk into a higher temperature. So today we have whole milk, we have semi-fat milk, so it should be a 2% fat milk. And then we have some almond milk to test out. So what I can give out as a tip normally is that dairy fat and dairy milk, normally you can push a higher temperature. Alternative milks, I always push for a much lower temperature, much colder. So in between 48 to even 50 something as a temperature, because alternative milk have vegetable type of cellular walls and vegetable type of oil. And vegetable oil tends to have a much lower temperature point compared to animal fat. So that's why whenever you're using testing alternative milk, always try to go into a much cooler steaming temperature so that you don't break down the cells and the fat itself of the vegetable oil. You'll see that the texture will become completely undrinkable if you go too hot on alternative milk. So when creating these recipes, we're thinking about these variables: what kind of milk composition I'm using, espresso, temperature, and then obviously the experience of the drinking of the milk beverage itself. If you're gonna use a specific type of cup, if you want people to mix the milk as well. And this is how sort of the measurements that we'll make. So we're gonna quickly get into how we develop these recipes for milk beverages, and we're gonna be measuring a few things. Obviously, we're gonna be measuring the amount of water that's being added back into the milk. We're steaming it, and then how much milk we're adding into the coffee itself, and then we're gonna do the flavor descriptions of each of these beverages. So I'm gonna start by extracting 2 shots of espresso for a milk drink, and then remeasure the milk quantity. Something important to note is that the quantity of the milk that you use to steam as well will greatly affect how much water you add back into it. The reason why that happens, it's because the more milk you have in your pitcher, the longer time it will take to steam and reach the higher temperature. But then also, obviously, you're adding more water because there's more vapor coming into the milk pitcher itself. So when you decide on how much milk quantity you're going to use to steam, it's also very important for you to evaluate before. Right now I'm using 250. So let's see how much water I'll add into the steaming now. So we have about 17 grams of water being added. So remember that the more milk you use to steam, the longer it will take and the more water will go in. So I'm going to quickly separate the milk here, and we'll measure how much milk we're adding into our coffee beverage. So each of these cups should have about 25 to 30 mLs of coffee. I'm gonna fill the first one all the way to the top just to see how much milk it can take into the whole cup. Right now we're sitting at about 90 for the first cup. So then for the second cup, I'm gonna add much less milk for us to compare. So about 46 grams of milk. So the ratios are quite different. We're gonna have different ratios in the sense of milk to espresso. So this is almost 3-to-1. Just put this down as a ratio, 3-to-1 ratio, and this is almost 2-to-1 of milk to coffee. And this is how we're testing different recipes. Normally I'll taste the bigger ratio first. We have good texture, but all very milk forward flavors. So it's more like milk chocolate and very intense milk flavor. There's obviously going to be a little bit more texture as well because there's more milk in the drink. The second one obviously is a lot more balanced, high coffee flavor. So this would be more of like a dark chocolate compared to the first one. So you can see that you can sort of balance out the ratios of milk to coffee and try to make sure that there's a good balance of coffee flavor and milk. This is how we manipulate and develop a milk recipe, to really truly balance for the milk beverage in itself. So always think about these ratios when you're developing the recipes, but also how much water it's being added and how much steaming power you're using when you're doing your milk recipes. So now we're gonna quickly move on into alternative milk for us to test as well how it works on steaming. So now we're gonna quickly compare using alternative milk when steaming and also recipe making. This should follow sort of the same rules that we do for regular steaming milk, but also it's important to understand how much more water is being added into an alternative milk compared to a traditional milk. Because mainly the biggest component into a milk drink that will affect flavor and how everything else is done in reality is water composition of your beverage. The more water you add, the more diluted it will be, less texture it will have, and obviously milk drink will be very, very different. So first we're going to start by extracting 2 espressos again. So I'm using about 190 grams of almond milk. So I have my espressos here. And we're going to start steaming our almond milk now. So just a reminder that alternative milks tend to heat up very quickly, and also with a much higher temperature it breaks down the vegetable oil, so it tends to not be a nice texture. So it's much harder to steam. Normally we will steam at a much lower temperature. And you may notice that almond milk or alternative milks, they really just don't expand as much as a traditional milk. So obviously I ended up adding a good amount of water into it. We're sitting at 14 grams here when steaming 190 grams of total milk. I'm gonna separate it. You can see the foam and the texture of alternative milks is a lot less stretchier than traditional milk, I would say. And that's mainly because the fat component is very different than traditional milk. So I'm gonna fill up the first cup, and you can see that the density will be different too. I'm gonna fill it up all the way to the top. So about 92 on the first cup, and then on the second cup we'll add a lesser quantity, about 35, so almost 3-to-1 ratio as well, and 2-to-1 ratio here. And then we can obviously taste the difference too. So normally alternative milk tends to have a lot more intense flavor. In this sense, I can taste definitely a lot more of bitterness of the almond itself, and the coffee is very low presence in the drink. And then at a lower ratio, there's sort of like the acidity of the coffee and lacking sweetness. So you can see that the different ratios that we use between the milk and coffee will greatly affect the balance of the drink. Nowadays, the huge trend really is to do 2-to-1 ratios or 1-to-1 ratios, especially because you're able to balance more out the milk beverage itself and create a really nice balanced coffee and sweet milk flavors. The important idea is that the milk never really overtakes the coffee itself. So that's very important to always think about when developing these milk drinks. And then always really explored many different milk compositions. When I competed, I always tried concentrating everything that I could and use that as a sort of a concentrated ingredient when making the milk drink. So I would do freeze distilled whole milk, freeze distilled lactose free, and then also evaporated alternative milks, and sort of blend those in and try to create sort of like a balanced, very intense milk that could really work well with our espressos too. So this is sort of something that you should always be measuring and testing when developing a milk drink as well.